Hey everyone, this is the future of the esports revolution. Is that what we?
Yeah.
Is that what we settled on the name? Yes. I'm Nate Scott. I'm from For the Win, which is a blog run by USA Today. I am filling in for a colleague who couldn't make it, so everyone please forgive me. This is not a space that I'm great in. I'm here to make sure everyone has a chance to talk and we don't run long. But just forgive me ahead of time because this is not a space I normally cover. But if anyone wants to talk about like soccer afterward, I'm available and would love to chat about that. The panelists today, Travis Gavard is a journalist and content creator with Yahoo Sports, Yahoo Esports.
Well, same thing.
Same thing. Stephanie Harvey is a professional gamer. Hi. And Stephen Ellis is a former professional gamer. And I'd like to let you guys introduce yourselves a little further.
Sure. So yes, as he said, I now work at Yahoo Esports. Previously, up until about 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, I was working for CBS Interactive for a long time for GameSpot, doing esports coverage for them. Started doing all this esports stuff about 5 years ago when I started a podcast called State of the League, which eventually led to me doing it full time. On the Yahoo Esports front, really excited because we just, again, it's sort of an initiative coming from the Yahoo Sports side to really build out this whole thing. So obviously I do content creation, do interviews and reporting for them, but also kind of helping internally to lead what is already a very enthusiastic company forward with the esports stuff.
Hello, so I'm Stephanie Harvey. I'm a professional gamer for CLG Red, so Counter Logic Gaming Red. We're an all-female team playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I won 5 World Cup throughout my years of playing CSGO. I've been in esports for 13 years. They hate when I say that. But I'm also a game designer. I've worked 8 years at Ubisoft Montreal. I just shipped Far Cry Primal. I was designing on the game. Also, I'm a bachelor in architecture, master in game design. And I built both my career independently, and now they're mashing up again because esports is becoming so big that it's interesting the industry. And I'm on a sabbatical right now doing it full time.
Hey guys, I'm Steven, otherwise known as Snoopy. I've been following the esports industry for about 12 years in total and working within it for about 5 years. I played professionally in League of Legends for about 4.5 years in total. And I was actually at the very start of Riot Games' journey in esports and the platforms like Twitch coming to fruition. So I've had an interesting journey over the last 4 or 5 years. And beyond that, I've since retired at the grand old age of 23. And I'm now moving on to doing independent consulting in and around the esports industry. So I work with whether it's angels that are looking at this space or brands that are looking at space. And I've even worked with some developers as well as teams and players.
All right, wonderful. So for the future of the esports revolution, I think we're going to be talking about the way it's going to grow, the way it will be structured, and quite literally what the games will be, what the future of these sports will be. I want to start by letting us get our bearings, though, really quickly. Travis, to start with you, just in the past 3 years, we've seen a rapid influx of money, rapid change in the industry. What have you noticed just in the past 3 years to get to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable to sort of see now at the start of 2016, comparing it to, here's a pretty good analogy. So when I started doing stuff covering the LCS, which is the big League of Legends series that they do, their league, it was back in 2013. And they were sort of running it out of a small little brick studio, no audience. There was no like press room or anything like that. It was just this small little thing, and we were told specifically not to shoot in in certain areas because they didn't want it to feel like small, and they didn't want the illusion of this awesome thing that they were producing. Now they have a dedicated studio space directly across from their office, right around the corner, with an audience that's live every week, gift store with all their merchandise, all this stuff. So just for me, and reflecting on all this stuff as I moved over to my new career, to my new job, it was very fascinating to see just how much even just the production of this one thing has changed so much in just such a short time. Besides that, I'm sure Stephen will be able to speak to this more since he's helping out a lot of these companies, but we've seen more and more non-endemic companies come in, so the big names and even on the sort of venture capital front, big investors coming in and realizing that there's a lot to be done within the space and that there's an audience that exists that is super passionate and actually actively rewards people who invest and help fund and support the things that they like. So it's a great time to be here over the past couple of years.
To me, it fits really with the growth of Twitch, of the accessibility. And I remember when I started playing, my parents, to watch me compete for thousands and thousands of dollars, they had to buy the game and like get the IP, connect through the console, and it took them like a significant amount of effort for people that don't know anything about technology to be able to watch me. My mom would like write, press power on the computer. Like each step was written. And now it's just, hey, I just Google like Miss Harvey and Twitch, and it changed everything. So that's why there's more spectator, more money. The growth is like incredible. Yep.
Stephen, money's coming in right now. You're trying to help companies figure out what to do with it. Is money coming in intelligently right now, or are people just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks?
So to preface your question, Nate, esports has grown rapidly in the last 4 or 5 years. So before we get to the future, it's just nice to set the stage. 5 years ago when I took my first contract, I decided to move to the other end of the world. I was living in Scotland, and I moved to the other end of the world in South Korea with a group of 5 guys, and was actually getting paid $0 at the time. My contract was $0. And I dropped out my last year in university. My parents thought I was mad. And I told them, this is what I want to do. I love it. And I got the opportunity to live out there in South Korea. Since then, I've had the opportunity to travel all around the world. And player salaries, I went from 1 year earning $0 a year. The next year, I was earning over 6 figures. And player salaries in the last 2 to 3 years have increased 200 to 300%. And a lot of that is big money coming into the space. And what was happening, I would say, probably about 2 years ago, or maybe even as early as a year ago, it wasn't the most intelligent money necessarily that was coming in. But Rahul Sood is in the room. He talked earlier about the money that's coming in now, and it's a lot smarter money that's coming into the space. And when that happens, it's a good indicator of an industry that's doing relatively well. So I do think there's a lot more smarter money. We're seeing team owners, especially in this space. We have Clinton Foya, he's up at the back there. He put together a round of investors for Immortals, and they're one of the best teams in North America for League of Legends. And we've seen Rick Fox and his team come in and create Echo Fox, which is a great brand. So I do think there's a lot smarter money coming into the space, and will continue to happen over the next year to 2 years.
Travis, how about you? What are you seeing in that? Just from a coverage standpoint, you know, you see the words Wild West thrown around in terms of esports right now. Do you think that's a fair descriptor?
Yeah, I do think it is, because ultimately you have a lot of people who are making a lot of bets on all this stuff, right? Because it is the very early days. You don't know what this is going to look like a couple of years, and obviously the point of this panel is for us to all kind of make some educated guesses, but I think that you do just see some crazy stuff. I mean, even the things that are happening with certain teams and organizations that are rising up, and maybe they don't have the strongest business sense or the strongest ethics, you end up with these kind of weird situations where players kind of get taken advantage of in certain situations. And I do think in a lot of ways it's the Wild West. I think it's also the Wild West in the sense that everybody who's kind of coming in doesn't really know what they're getting themselves into, not just on the business front, but it's just like it's very fun to talk with the Yahoo Sports guys, right? Because I know very little about traditional sports, but I'm now working with award-winning producers who are really interested in all this stuff, and so we compare all these notes, we have all these conversations, and it's just kind of hilarious, the conversations I have with them, where they're, you know, I was talking to one of our main MLB columnists the other day, and he's like, so all the players just live together in a house? And they just do that? They don't go home, they just all live there together and just play video games all day? And it's just very interesting conversations that are being had. So I do think, yeah, as this stuff gets figured out, we'll see everybody kind of understand it, but across the board, it's definitely the Wild West, in my opinion. And
to touch on it, one of the premier esports titles, some of you'll know, is League of Legends. It's a game by Riot Games. And to speak, you can buy an LCS slot, which is essentially a slot in their league. And in 2013, that slot was worth $80,000. 2014, that slot was worth $400,000. And in 2015, those LCS slots were going from $800,000 to $1.2 million. Now coming into 2016, there's an argument where we want to move to a franchise system, so you can't potentially buy those slots. But just to see that rapid growth over the course of 4 years, people are really fighting over these slots to get positions within these premier top leagues. And that's a really interesting, if you look at the evolution and where that's going, it could be, and I think in this offseason coming, LCS slots could be potentially worth $5+ million. And I don't think that would be unprecedented.
It's basically what he's speaking to is buying a team. You're essentially buying a team within this league, and that's crazy to see what's happening there.
You talk about the franchise model. Are we going to see a day with an overarching commissioner, with a league that mandates and controls everything going on in esports?
I mean, I feel it's a double-edged sword. It could help a lot of points, but it could also be not great. Because right now, what we're seeing with LCS and Riot essentially kind of owns I don't want to talk out of my element right now, so you guys can tell me if I'm wrong. But what I'm observing with the leagues is that they're basically Riot-based. So Riot decides whatever tournaments can appear, and they also decide on the support and everything, which creates for healthy players. Like, they have a healthy lifestyles. They don't travel all the time. They don't have to choose between tournaments. It's basically their schedule is scheduled for all year. If you compare it to the CSGO, where it's way more the Wild Wild West, so there's a tournament every weekend where you have to decide on where to go around the world. There's leagues online every night. Players never get a break. They don't have vacations and etc. But it also creates for extremely vibrant and diversified community. So having one commissioner to run them all probably is a better long-term viability, but I also see a lot of amazing potential with kind of allowing these smaller tournaments and these smaller events to grow and just create an awesome scene.
To build on Stephanie's point, one of the biggest, most contentious issues facing the future of esports is IP law and broadcasting rights surrounding that. Game developers essentially own the intellectual property. So Riot Games owns League of Legends and can decide what happens with that. In the NFL, no one owns football. No one owns soccer. No one owns rugby. This is unique to the gaming industry, where a Blizzard or Activision own all the properties, and they can dictate the content deals they do with that. So if a governing body was to come into the space, who are they to overrule the developers and the IP that they actually own? I do think there's potentially cases where that's going to happen, but I think it's going to take legal precedent for it to happen, where someone is going to have to challenge the authority that these developers and publishers actually have. And maybe you could consider that perhaps these companies have a monopoly on their ecosystem, and that could be an angle you take as a legal case. I'm not a lawyer by any means, but IP law is going to be one of the more contentious things as we go forward as an industry.
Any thoughts, Travis?
I mean, I think they've mostly covered all of it. I think there's a lot of benefit to having either some sort of governing entity over an individual esport. There's always conversations, and I think this is kind of what you were hinting at as well, which is like, should there be some sort of governing body that covers across multiple esports, right? There was a really funny situation a couple years back where there was this like esports summit conference that happened in Valencia, DreamHack Valencia. Do you guys remember this at all? Whenever all the leaders and publishers, and it was supposed to be like the whole industry coming together to figure out a way to all work together so that the publishers weren't pitting tournaments against each other on the same weekend and all this stuff. And the tournament organizers could all figure the stuff out. Ultimately, it feels like nothing happened out of that because you still have all these weird situations where a world championship might be happening at the same time as this other thing, and it doesn't really seem like any of these guys are linked up and talking together. So I think even more than maybe or in comparison to a central governing body, it would be really interesting to see something where at least there's an alliance or a much broader conversation that's happening between all these different companies. It'll be interesting to see if that ever happens with the publishers, but I think as we see more like media companies come in and purchase the tournament organizations, and get involved in this stuff, you'll start to see these companies that already have talks with each other on different fronts start to have talks with each other on the esports front. So maybe that's what will happen there.
This was touched on in the last panel, but I want to ask, because we have a current player and a former player here, the issue of public player salary being known. Does it need to happen? When does it need to happen? And how will it happen? I know
We
those are
have
a lot
a
of questions.
strong opinion on this. Maybe you can answer first, and I'll.
So the reason that even got entertained regarding publishing player salaries was hopefully it would incentivize team owners to create more transparency, and as such that would elevate all the other team owners who can step up their game and allow players to actually know their value. Because right now a big issue in the industry is the players are somewhat forgotten. These kids that are 17 years old don't have anyone representing them or working with them to help them understand their value. And in the current climate, I would say about 90% of professional players in the industry don't get a lawyer to vet their contract. They'll sign themselves away for a year to even 3 years in some cases, or even in Asia it could be up to 5 years, and they don't even get a lawyer to vet their contract. Some of these contracts are worth very little amount, whether that could be $40,000, it could be all the way up to $200,000, and these players are not getting their contracts vetted. So I think we as an industry, and this is why it came around, is challenging team owners to create a more transparent environment to help these players, is to get them to understand their value and start to educate themselves on how they should think about their futures and their careers. Do I think it's going to happen? I honestly don't. I think too many team owners are too sensitive, and understandably to agree, I think they're too sensitive about publishing player salaries. I think there's going to be some front runners that are quite eager, that especially the angel-backed teams or teams that are getting outside money coming in, they're going to be further incentivized to publish player salaries because they're not as concerned about revenue at the moment, whereas the teams that are basically relying on sponsorships or endorsements to stay afloat, they're more conservative with their spending. And I think those which make up the majority of teams, I would say about 80% of teams still rely on endorsements, don't want to publish player salaries, which is understandable. I think it's first to move to a system where there's more transparency and support for the players. It's first going to start with players getting lawyers and caring more about what they're getting themselves into. And beyond that, as those salaries start to increase, we're going to see agents come into the space and individual representation. Right now, if you're an agent at a large agency like William Morris Endeavors or creative artists agency, there's no real business model behind representing esports players, because if you're only making $100,000 and you're taking 10% of that, that's $10,000, and you'd have to rent 10 clients just to make 100K. That's not a really attractive business proposition when they're dealing with superstars that are making millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. So I think we need to move in a direction of individual representation, and then that'll help elevate the players, not necessarily making transparent salaries quite yet, because the revenue streams are not flowing into the teams appropriately.
Yeah.
You have any thoughts, Stephanie, before I jump in?
Just real quick, as a player that ran my whole career on my own, my whole life, I couldn't agree more with this, because you're 17, you have no idea what your worth is, and I'm 29 and I still don't really know. So I think it's important that we get some support, especially because we're not making millions, so I can't hire someone full-time to work on my career. So whether it's from the player unions, which could be all the players could release their salary at some point. We don't have to wait for the team owners. Maybe that's the solution. But I currently know of extremely disparities in salaries amongst like top teams compared to lower teams, how the lower teams are paid like double the salary of top teams just because of poorly signed contracts or unaware that they were worth more. So it's really sad, actually.
Yeah, so this is a fun conversation topic for me because back in December, some enterprising young journalist did a video about how he thought that salary should be transparent. You guys can go check it out. It's me in front of a webcam. Anyway, it was really, really interesting to see the response because I did not expect that. I think that previously there was a lot of discussion around player unions, and we had some former pros that said they were going to go off and do a players union. But there wasn't really any realization of that. For me, I think following the end of the LCS trade season and off season, where you start to hear none of these. First off, none of these salaries are public. It's not just a situation where the players don't know about it. It's also a situation where the fans don't know about it. And so you hear about all this kind of stuff happening, and as a journalist, you hear rumors and you can try to report on it, but because the industry is so small, it's very risky to report on anything because ultimately the numbers just aren't. It's like hard to find out, like, is that a real number? Is it not? So I did this video where I was talking about how I really felt as though this needed to happen because of a lot of the reasons that have already been discussed, but in addition to the fact that I felt like some players didn't know that a person who might have equivalent value on their own team is making twice as much as them, I also felt as though this was important for the industry to start to have an idea of, what are players making? What is the average salary? What is the gap in salary between a top tier player on a top team versus a player that's on a bottom team? And so I kind of positioned that whole argument out there. And then actually within that next week, it was pretty much, especially on the League of Legends front, you had owners coming out on both sides of the issue, doing vlogs, going on shows, releasing Twitlonger posts, and about their opinions. And I felt like the discussion was really healthy, right? You had a lot of concern around, from the traditional guys to the guys that had been around before, about whether or not this was a good idea to do in face of what they considered to be salary inflation from some of the new VC teams coming in, spending a ton of money on getting top-tier contracts. And honestly, also one of the challenger teams that had a lot of money did actually publicly release what their salaries were. Almost, I think it kind of was a backlash against them where a lot of people were like, okay, these guys are overpaid. So it's just very fascinating to me. I don't think that a union is on the horizon. Every team owner universally pretty much came out and said, well, we believe in a union. A union would help out. But as Stephen can speak to this, like, a union is far away from where we are right now, I think. And so it'll be interesting to see how this stuff develops, but I do think that right now all that power exists in the owners, and the vast majority of them would rather not have the salaries become transparent.
Stephen, why are we far away from a union?
When I was playing, I was a huge advocate of players and them kind of leveling up that power dynamic, because there's a huge disparity. At the very top, you have the publishers and developers, then you might have the broadcasting platforms, and then you had the teams back when I was playing, and the players were way down here. No one was really talking on behalf of them, and the players weren't talking even together at that point. So once I retired at 23, I looked at could we create a union and what's involved in that? And I learned, just because of how fragmented and how young the industry is, we're really not ready for a union quite yet. It would require the players to heavily invest in it, and they don't think collectively, they don't even think individually necessarily. Sorry to the players out there, but to an extent, you're focused on the game, you're kicking ass, you're number one in the world, right? You're not necessarily thinking about what's going on around you. And until they start thinking about that, you can't really push for collective bargaining and having them submit member fees, etc. We're just so far, I wouldn't say we're incredibly far away, I just think it's a couple of years out at the very least. I think we do have to start with players wisening up themselves and getting lawyers first to vet their contracts, then individual representation, and then I think we'll move to collective bargaining. Whether that's a full-on union or just some efforts or causes that we want to push. I think the first people that are going to unionize are actually the teams. And maybe not full-on union, but I do think the teams are going to very shortly collectively bargain against publishers like Valve, like Riot Games, like your Activision Blizzards. The teams are going to band together and want to create change in certain places. As the industry starts to monetize more and more revenues flowing in, a lot of that actually can go through the publishers because they ultimately have the control. And teams are now thinking, where's our share of that pie? And that's their right. I think teams should consider they should be getting a cut of that pie, but I think they should be sensitive to how young the industry is and not put too much pressure or too much conflict against the developers, because that could actually cause a lot of harm in the industry if they're not conscious of how they go about that. I think first we should look to cooperate and collaborate with each other. before full-on unionization or anything like that.
In CSGO, it's a little different actually because of the chaos in the community. So I think the union might come faster. Just because right now we have issues where tournaments are poorly ran. The players are getting there playing until 5 a.m. in incredibly horrible conditions, or where they don't have food, or I'm not saying that they're not to pity them. I'm just saying that there's some tournaments that they wouldn't have gone if they knew the quality of the tournament. And a lot of players are like, all right, here's the minimum basis that we want to have if we want to attend a tournament. So it might not be like an official union where people pay, but it might be just an organization. Hey, if you want your tournament being stamped or something by our seal of approval, so that players actually know they're gonna be well treated or something when they go. Like that might be something that might be the first step before being unioned, but something is going on right now in CSGO world regarding it.
That's what I've heard. If you'd like to talk more about that after the interview, or after the panel, that would be great.
Okay.
Quickly, I want to just touch on this idea of player protection. It was discussed on the last panel, and I got the sense that it was basically like, trust the team owners, they're going to take care of these kids, hopefully. These are, 17-year-old kids who are excited and confident and believe in themselves and don't know a lot about the world. Is there a way to protect these kids, or is this just 17-year-olds are going to be 17-year-olds?
I mean, like the team owners want to protect them, but in the end, they're still running a business. They might treat you guys as family, but if they have to have tough choices, they're going to choose probably their team first. So these kids are pretty much by themselves. And there's not much more to say unless their parents are extremely involved. But my parents had no idea what I was doing, so I was all on my own. They were super happy I was doing well, and that's about it. But thankfully, I had a head on my shoulder, and I managed to pull through. But most kids, they sign a contract, they're 18, they travel the world, and they're happy with it, which is understandable because they don't know their value.
And I will say this is an issue as well in traditional sports where the bankruptcy rate among former athletes is outrageous. And you can see we're not talking that much money, as much money here. So
was it not Sports Insider that said, they released a statistic in like 2012 or something where 80% of NFL players within 3 years of being out of the league go bankrupt or have financial problems at least?
yeah.
That is crazy.
And they're making a lot. They're making millions is like their base. Some of them making a lot more. And we're talking here with players making $30,000 to $40,000. Yes, the top echelon players are making up to $200K, but that's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. Even if your expenses are low over the course of a couple of years, your career span on average is about 3 to 4 years. Stephanie is a huge exception to the rule, but typically your career is about 3-4 years. And if you're saving $40K a year, that's not a lot of money to live on. You can blow through 200K or whatever very quickly, especially if you've not developed skill sets to carry you outside of that and to transition into a different career, whether that's within or outside the industry. So yeah, players do need to be a lot more cognizant in general.
Yeah, I think that overall, I think your question was how can they be helped or whatever. I think having bigger conversations about this publicly, for a long time, for instance, there's a lot of talk right now around how players are classified within an organization or within a company, because for a while they were just all sort of classified as independent contractors, and there's actually a great deal of, and I don't even pretend to know all the details, but obviously, like if you're having a contractor like live in a house that you own and work oftentimes like 80 hours. I mean, Steven, you can speak to how long, and Stephanie, how long these guys actually practice. It's a tremendous amount of time. And you have this person as part of your organization or company for multiple years. It's like, oh, maybe they're no longer considered an independent contractor. Maybe they were supposed to be an employee this entire time. But that's something that a player will never think about, because the player's thinking about how are they going to get first at the next tournament. So I think as the industry continues to talk about this more publicly and less behind closed doors, and that these things are out there on Twitter and on different sites, and people are doing videos, and these conversations are happening, I think it's something that the players will start to become more aware of, and they're like, wait, where's my insurance? Why aren't I getting a 401k or some sort of benefits? I'm spending all this time working for you. Like, Why am I just a contractor? I think those conversations will help lend to conversations behind closed doors too.
I want to pivot the conversation to the production side and the broadcasting side. Do you guys see 5-10 years from now, are we looking at a model like UFC where there are big events that lots of people tune into on standard television? Will this continue to be, to use the term again, the Wild West, where tournaments are scheduled kind of erratically and people go in? How do you see this going from the broadcasting side? As well, is the broadcasting quality, how do you rate it now and how will it improve?
So I think if you're running an esports event, you're not making a lot of money right now. It doesn't, whether it's as high end as a Riot Games production or it's your conventional ESLs, your MLGs running the event, they're barely making any money, if any. They might even, in Riot's case, operating in a loss because it's a strategy that they're going forward with. I think in the future, it's hard because esports is global. It's not like the NFL where it's heavily concentrated in America. And getting a high concentration of people to turn up to an event in Colorado or even Austin is going to be a difficult thing to do because the audience is so fragmented globally. And that's an attractive thing, but also if you're running physical events, maybe a lot harder. And I'll tell you now, even though there's been some huge successes where the Staples Center was sold out in under an hour, or there was 40,000 people attended the Sangnam World Cup Stadium in South Korea. These are phenomenal numbers, but it's very, very hard to fill those kind of stadiums, and certainly not on a consistent basis. Where the real interesting thing is online, where people are watching, whether that's from their bedrooms or from cinemas or collectively in their living rooms, watching people play the tournaments at physical studios and having the kind of odd big event. So I think more and more people will do smaller studio type events with better experiences for the viewer digitally.
So I disagree a little bit because I feel like as the audience grows, there will be an ability to fill out these arenas more. I do think that I like the Riot model where they have like a consistent league, and you kind of have, similar to a lot of traditional American sports leagues, you kind of have like the mid-season games where you're like, okay, like neither of these teams are very good. It's not very exciting to watch. You can put that in a studio. You don't need to put that in an arena. But I do like having the really big moments, and I think as stuff grows, I don't think we'll see anytime soon like an MLB or NFL model where there's just like arenas around the U.S. and you just go to your local place to see your local team play. But I do think that we will start to see more and more arena-style events, especially if the other games continue to follow sort of the format and model that we see in CSGO. Perhaps they'll start to formalize around a league structure in some way where you don't have to do a ton of travel internationally every single weekend. But I think just the audience will continue to support. And I think there's a great deal of passion from the fans who want to see in person their players on a stage. Or want to have those moments where you see like these guys walk out with a bunch of music and all this exciting stuff around them. And I think that that's what's really going to draw people to some of these bigger things. I mean, there are some instances where it's hard to sell at studios or stadiums, but I think more and more we're seeing more and more stadiums sell out quicker. So that's why I disagree.
I don't want to be the deciding factor here.
Yeah, you have to call. Yeah.
No, so I'll just talk about the online area. You talked about the UFC and pay-per-view model. I think it would be great. I think it might even work. I think it's something that we haven't explored at all. I think Dota 2 is trying to explore it with like the tickets. You could buy tickets to see some events that if you only had the free version, you couldn't. So I think it's something that's interesting to think. And also, especially if the money goes back to the players, something that Valve does a lot with the stickers, again, on CSGO and stuff like that. So I think that's great. It's a good incentive for people to invest money, the spectators to invest money, and also the players are really excited because it's a lot of revenues, and the teams are also excited because they get a portion of it to pay for their team expenses. So that's really awesome. But I also think that we don't have to fight the sport model. we don't have to copy exactly the sport model. I think what's really great about esports is that it's its unique model. It's something that has never been done before, where interactivity owns only just watching. A lot of people just watch the chat, or a lot of people just want to get involved and be part of the story because it's long and it's long events that last for days, and people like block their calendar and watch it for days. It's something that's completely unique. And we don't have that kind of model in sports right now, maybe outside of the Olympics. That happens like once every 4 years, or yeah. So I think it's something that's relatively new, and we don't really know how to exploit it yet at its full potential. But I'm excited that we're different. I mean, I'm excited that we already are finding ways that traditional medias have never found. I always say that esports is basically in their teenage years, where they don't know where to go, and they don't know what they are and who they will be. While we compare TV and books and cinema to be already fully grown humans. So we still don't know where we're going to be, but I'm excited to be part of the journey.
Just to end this, I think that your mentioning of the UFC, just to sort of go on a side tangent here, I think that UFC, though I'm not particularly interested in it, I know that I feel like it's a pretty strong analogy for where esports is headed. UFC obviously was a very much smaller thing for a while, and now it's become a very, very big thing. I think that if you look at just the path that industry has followed and the sponsorships that have come in, and like the bigger conversation where it went from smaller networks to bigger networks, and I think that that's something that I look at to try to guess, what direction we're headed.
Sorry, I'm going to chime in, Nate. I know it's a long question, but as Stephanie was touching on, esports has the opportunity to define what it is. We have 100 years of sports to look back on and learn all the awesome things they did, but also all the bad things they did and lessons they learned along the way. We have a unique opportunity to define the roadmap of what esports is going to look like, and we shouldn't look to emulate traditional sports. And beyond that, when I think about the world in general, we're talking about the future of esports, and I want to play this into the future of media or the future of society in a way. It might get all philosophical, but I think we're becoming more and more digitally based. Like, we live on digital platforms more and more. We spend more time on social media, and we're having less of these physical interactions at large. And that's why I believe more in the fact that we're going to consume content and entertainment and sports in our bedrooms or in a different environment, whether that's moving into virtual reality and AR in the future. I just think we're not going to physically be in locations as much as we are now or have been in the past. And that's why I think we'll move towards, and that might not be in the next 3 years, that might be in the next 20 years. But just talking about the future of sports, I guess, and entertainment in general.
Last one, then I want to open it up. Talking about the way it's being marketed, the way it's being tried to sell, I have a lot of experience covering action sports, X Games, snowboarding, that world. There seems to be kind of a marketing attempt to try to mesh these two worlds together, and I'm interested if you guys think that's a natural fit or if it's a ridiculous just trying to take two things that young men are thought to like and just jamming them together in an unnatural way.
Well, there was a big debate a couple of months ago because during the X Games this year, one of the female athletes, because Alo was at the X Games and she tweeted something like, gamers should never be allowed to get a gold medal at the X Games because they don't deserve it. We risk our lives. They don't. Something like that. I'm not quoting it exactly how she said it, but it was poorly received within the gaming industry. So, but the main thing that I took out of everyone's argument was that X Games traditionally has been trying to push barriers of what is a sport and what is considered a sport competition. And I believe that the question, is esports a sport, hasn't been answered yet. There's some that are for and some are against. And I think that it's great that X Games want to explore it and see if they have a public for it or not. So I think that it's great that they're doing this initiative with gamers. And that's my political answer.
I think it was a skier, this female skier who came out and tweeted essentially, yeah, exactly what Stephanie said. they don't deserve gold medals at the X Games. And I actually agree with her, but I don't agree with the way in which she said it. She didn't even filter what she was thinking before going to social media, and you should never do that. Always think before you post on social media, because it lives there. You can't get rid of it afterwards. So she basically sent out this live tweet of her thoughts straight onto her phone. And I think if she went back in hindsight, she would have framed it differently. I don't believe that that esports should be at an extreme sporting event. That's what it is. It's an extreme sporting event. That's what the X Games is, and it should be that. It's entitled to be that. Esports has a wide audience, and there is this question of whether it is a sport or isn't a sport, but it doesn't matter. I just don't think we should be at an extreme sporting event. There's other collaborations we can consider doing and other venues we can go to, but I think she was quite entitled to say, this is an extreme sporting event, and esports is not an extreme physical sport, which is what they're advocating. So I think there's different places that we can go with esports. I just don't think that's the right marriage for us. And so I do agree with her, but just the way in which she framed it and blurted her thoughts out on her phone was probably not the correct thing to do.
I actually don't mind esports at the X Games. I think for now, because I think right now people who want to do these esports events, surprise pitting on a giant event is quite costly and it's a big endeavor. So if you can kind of attach it to something that already has the space and the production crew and all the stuff and the brand and marketing stuff, it's not that it can be very beneficial for both sides, right? So I think that for now, I think it's valuable on the business front. And I do kind of like it only in that it sparked that type of conversation, right? Like having esports at the X Games sparked that conversation, which while controversial, probably helped raise awareness of esports as a whole. Not that we need that too much anymore. I think people are really starting to realize that this is a thing. But I think for now it's fine. I think that if you look at the sponsors that are at the X Games for the extreme sports stuff, that stuff they probably see a lot of value on the esports side as well. So I think that for all I know, it might also be an attempt to help the X Games a little bit, right? And so I think that stuff is good for now. I think ultimately we'll start to see more separation, but I don't mind it as much for the time being.
Let's open it up to any questions we have from the audience. There is a microphone right there, and we ask that if you do have a question, you step right up there.
Yay, involvement.
Thanks so much for the panel, guys. Question for Stephen. As a consultant, how have you seen big brands get involved with esports from an advertising perspective or a brand partnership perspective?
I think the big issue with esports in general is it lives online, and a lot of brands don't necessarily understand the digital space yet, whether that's from a data and analytics standpoint or just how to organically fit in an authentic way with the audience. And a few brands have really executed on that very, very well. Some brands that come to mind are Kingston, who make memory. And how can you make memory sexy and integrate authentically? But they pulled it off really well. They came out with this HyperX brand and really integrated with the audience. And I think the question is authenticity. You can't just come and plaster your name all over the space. You really have to find a fit and a strong association with whoever you're going in with. There has to be a story to tell to connect you to that team or that tournament or whatever. You can't just come in and put your name there. There has to be something meaningful and authentic about it.
Also, I think with streaming, where's the guy that asked the question? Oh, hey. I also think that with streaming, it changes the game. Because right now, I don't have to do a Pepsi commercial. I have one. I'm not sponsored by Pepsi at all. I don't have to do hey, buy Pepsi. I'm just streaming and I'm drinking Pepsi, right, for 8 hours. So you see me, basically, this is, for me as a viewer, this is way stronger marketing than the commercial. And I think brands don't get it yet. All my clothing when I'm streaming should be sponsored. I should have, everything I do on stream should be sponsored. Because that's so much, my viewers every day, they can ask me, oh, you're drinking Pepsi? Oh, is it a new brand? Oh yeah, I just got that, I'm trying it. I like it, this is way more approachable and way stronger for people. Hey, I'll go buy it. Oh, go buy it and tell me tomorrow, what do you think about it? I'm gonna go buy it. Tomorrow they'll be like, oh, it was so good. Or more people will buy it, so I think they don't get that yet.
Just to chime on that, one of the only issues with that is you're working with 17-year-old kids who are incredibly talented, but when you ask them to market a product, if it's a Pepsi and they're drinking their can, they're going to come off in a certain way, and especially through a product endorsement standpoint, it's very difficult to get them to positively represent your brand. And what I would advise is finding a fit with something that I use, right? If I like a certain clothing band, work with me. Don't try and force a relationship just for the eyeballs. Really have something that strongly connects that brand with that particular person. I might be very into cars, and I would love a car sponsorship, by the way. I don't care who you are, just give me a car sponsorship. But that might be a fit for that specific person, and maybe they're really into Nissan or whatever it is. Just try and find a really authentic fit, because then it's not forced, and you're asking people without degrees in marketing or PR to authentically endorse your product. It has to be authentic, and the relationship has to already somewhat exist.
Yeah, I think people just need to know what they're getting into whenever they get into esports, because if you try to force it and you try to do something that makes sense in kind of the traditional media world, and then you try to do that in esports, it's not going to resonate. Not only will whoever you're working with have a hard time pulling it off, but you're also going to not see as much interest from the community and the audience. I think you need to be ready to drop some kappas into, to quote Twitch chat, into your marketing, and you need to be ready to find the stuff that feels really good with the fans that are watching your stuff.
People are very loyal too. When Monster Gaming started a couple of years ago, joined esports, everybody was all over Monster, just because, oh my God, a mainstream company is supporting esports. I want to support them too. So right now we're still at the phase where any company that comes into esports, the fans are just like, oh, thank you. Well, let's buy your product. Like literally. So maybe it won't be like that in a couple of years, but right now it's still the case.
Hi, thanks for the panel, guys. My name's Tom. My question is about post-playing careers and the role of education during, how that would interact with the player's career. So, I mean, for instance, Snoopy, you kind of are the exception in my mind of a person who's able to take their status and kind of turn that into a post-playing career. Crepo, for instance, there's analogs in professional sports of a player who's turned into a caster. And then you've got players like Cali Trolls who took a year off of their schooling and then played LCS and decided to go back to school. So I guess is the onus on the player, the organization, the publisher, developer, who makes sure that these kids are getting the life development coaching that they need?
So the onus is on everyone, and it's and I don't want you to take this from we should all be helping the players. The players themselves have to want to help themselves. You can't, even you as an industry can do everything in your power to help support and elevate the players, but if the players don't want to bite and actually invest in themselves and their future, they're just not going to, and by all means that's a lost case. But we as an industry, whether you're me, myself, a former player, or Stephanie, who's somewhat of a veteran player, Travis, the journalist, or team owners, or publishers like Riot Games, we all share a responsibility to help the players understand where they are in their lives and to consider things about their future. So it's not good just to sit there and play for 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and get #1 in the world. That will get you so far, but you won't develop any skill sets outside of that. And you need to consciously think about that. Riot, great example. There's a lot of different developers and ecosystems out there, but Riot biannually puts on a player summit. And they'll put on certain media training, PR training, even some if you want to just talk to someone about what's going on, there's all these different avenues that you can approach people with and approach experts in the subject. But some players, and I've been in these summits, some players just turn off and don't even try to engage. And that's those players' faults, and that'll bite them in the ass in 3 years' time when they retire and have nothing to show for it, but maybe 60, 100,000 in the bank, which it's not a lot of money at the end of the day. If those players don't want to engage with the opportunities out there, that's also their fault. But it is, as an industry, we must help them understand the things going on around them.
I think it comes also the agents. When there's more agents, they're going to think about that because they don't want their players to be irrelevant right after their career. So they're probably going to focus on that. And also, we are going to have kids. We're going to be aware of what esports is. So we're going to try to raise our kids as good as we can, compared to my parents that had no idea what this was. So I think the generation will also evolve towards it. Also the education system. I know in Canada, I was considered as a sport athlete. So I had the same privileges as any sports athlete on the campus in my university. So I was able to skip exams and do it later or earlier. Official exams that the whole country had to do at the same time. I was able to do it to fit my competitive schedule. So I had a lot of support from my university. And if these players can't have that, they'll drop out. And I finished all my degrees. just because I had the flexibility to do it. But if my university wouldn't have allowed it, then I wouldn't have done it. So I think it's also a support of the whole society to accept that it's okay to game as long as you can continue studies if you want to and stuff like that. So I think that's really important.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So we talked a lot about the future of esports. I'd like to ask you guys what you think the future of streaming is and what impact that'll have on esports.
I think it already changed everything. I think that a couple of years ago, the most relevant players in the world were the best players in the world. And then it became YouTubers. And then all of a sudden, it was streamers. So it didn't matter if you were the best player in the world. Streamers had more money, more power, more fans. So best players had to start streaming because they were becoming irrelevant. And why would a company like my team, CLG or Immortals earlier, keep top teams if they could just have streamers who would have more influence and a bigger fan base? So it was important for the players to open up their fan base by starting to stream. Also, it secures personal revenues that isn't controlled by your team because you're getting donation, you're getting subs, you're getting like another side of your career is secured. So, and you also know that post-career, you can continue doing that and you have an idea of how much money you'll get. So I think it's changing everything. We've seen teams want to get involved into streaming. We also seen tournaments get bigger and bigger because of streaming. Like I was saying earlier, accessibility is incredible now just because of streaming, because it's so easy. You just turn it on. It's like online TV. It's new. It's brand new. It's amazing, and thank God it exists, because maybe my game would have died without it.
I kind of steal that one. Sorry, Travis. I think that streaming is a new form, not just specific to esports. Obviously, esports is this sexy platform. We're talking about Twitch and things like that. But I think streaming in general is going to change the way in which we consume media more broadly. I think that influencers over the past 5 to 10 years, whether that's in entertainment, sports, music, etc., they're being further and further empowered through, first it was social media, now it's things like Snapchat and Periscope, or we had Mob Crush up here on the last panel. These kind of platforms are empowering influencers in ways in which we've never had before. And I think a lot more as we go into the future, there's going to be a lot more influencers living on these platforms through streaming and being empowered themselves and actually not belonging to media agencies or big entities that have ownership over them. They're going to be completely independent. And I think that's the future of streaming, essentially. And it's even more broad than that. You can empower the guy sitting in his bedroom to reach a global audience, which is phenomenal. If you just think about that, you're sitting in your room, you turn your webcam on and you go live, and suddenly you're reaching, or have the potential to reach, 3+ billion people. That's the power at your footstep or doorstep. And me myself, I was in my small room in Scotland. I barely fit a bed in there, and I had a PC kind of crammed up against the bed, and I was streaming to 30,000 people. And when you give people that platform, I think it's insanely powerful. And that goes more broadly than just esports, just gaming. It's for every industry.
Yeah, I think streaming, in addition to social media, like esports is so different from traditional sports in the fact that it rose up following the rise of social media, and right around the time, especially started to become a huge thing once streaming took off. It just completely changes the game and completely differentiates our industry from the traditional sports industry, because there's just no level of like intimate connection between somebody who's like watching a sports, an athlete, and they're following their career. They can't just go home and like watch them sitting in their home just hanging out, right? Like that just does not happen.
Except for a rare few.
Yeah, there's a couple, right? And there's a couple even sports fans who have started to get into streaming, and they want to stream stuff, actually esports titles and that kind of thing. So it's very fascinating. But I've been thinking a lot about, as an example, how teams brand themselves, especially because we have so many organizations that are coming in. And it's so interesting, right? Because the players themselves control so much of the brand of the organization now. And they don't really realize it, but like the shirts and the merchandise and like the things that get associated with them, actually, so much of the stuff comes out of streaming. Hotshot GG, a former boss of Steven and currently kind of a boss of Stephanie, He went on, not necessarily streaming though, he's done this in streaming before, but he went on Reddit and started this whole thing of like the golden age of CLG and the bronze age of CLG and all these different, his organization became this meme, and it became like almost the identity of his League of Legends team for an entire split. And so I think that, yeah, the personalities and esports are dictating the brands of the sports, of their organizations in a way that sports teams haven't, and I think that's incredibly fascinating. The final thing I'll say is that I also think it's really interesting that streaming actually kind of in some ways undermines esports at the moment, just in the fact that it is such a huge temptation for a huge star, an esports athlete, to stop competing and get into streaming because they know that they can make sometimes 5 times as much money as they're making competing by becoming a streamer. I couldn't go an hour-long panel without mentioning Doublelift. Pretty good example of a player who last year, halfway through the year, contemplated quitting and going streaming full-time because he knew he could do, he could make way more money doing that. So I just think the streaming stuff is incredibly fascinating.
This will be our last question.
I've just got a question about, sort of touches on what Tom wants to do with sort of player development and player safety almost. What are your thoughts on gaming houses with players having to move in and live and work in the same place and not really having any disconnect between the two? Do you think that's a good thing for them as young people, or do you think that's just leading to burnout in the
I'm so happy
community?
you asked that question, because I wanted to talk about it the whole time, but we never got to that subject. I think it's a Band-Aid. I think it's a Band-Aid, and because Riot has that model, and it's been really effective for them. A lot of other sphere and gaming houses are popping up for other games and stuff. I think it's actually horrible for a long-term viability. I'm currently in a gaming house. I've lived on my own for my whole life. So as 29, I'm moving in back with 5 other roommates. It's not that great, meaning I can't differentiate. Like, I'm always in my room because that's my apartment, so it's really hard. And especially in those gaming houses, in the league houses, there's a lot of rules, like no girlfriend rules or whatever. And these guys can't see their girlfriends like only once a week. Like, they can't really have a normal social life. It's not really possible. They never but they don't realize it because they're 20. And that's fine because they're 20 and they think that, oh, I'm living the dream. And they are living the dream. But if they want to keep this career for, like we were saying, you're saying that careers last like 3 to 4 years, but there's a reason for it. Sometimes also mentally it's draining. You're living in the house for 3 years with the same people. Every day is about the game, and you have almost no personal time, and your whole schedule is booked all the time, and you get like 2 weeks of vacation every 6 months. Like, that's not a long-term thing. I would like to go to the office at 3, and if I'm late, then there's an issue. I would like to have my own apartment. But right now, it's too costly for the teams to do both, and we have to make sacrifices. But hopefully, in the future, it's going to get better regarding that.
Yeah, I think Stephanie covered a lot of the points. Just to touch on my experience, I've done all sorts of models. I've worked and lived online essentially at one point, where we just were competing on servers online. I've worked in gaming houses. I've also worked in apartments where we travel to an office space. The best model I've found so far is the office space environment. And it also, the important thing is that by having an apartment, it teaches you life skills, which is just, it's the stupidest thing, right? That you really undervalue. If you're a college student, for example, you go through the experience of living on dorms and developing all sorts of life skills that these kids otherwise don't. And there's an argument to be said that if they want to compete, like if League of Legends, there's 80, 90 million people playing every month, and you want to be in the top 100 of that, there's an argument saying you should remove all sorts of distractions away from them and only have them focus on the game. There's some people making that argument, but I honestly think it's better that there's a more balanced approach to how athletes train and compete. I don't think it's good to do the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000-hour approach, where you basically practice 14 hours a day for 6 days a week. I don't think that's a healthy approach. I think playing 6 hours a day or whatever, or 5 hours a day, and then doing VOD analysis, and then having a mental break. The whole argument about boyfriends, girlfriends, I think it's an interesting one to me, because I've seen so many players screw up their careers by having boyfriends and girlfriends. I do think that if you're a top athlete, in any sport, whether that's esports or traditional sports, or a top musician or a gymnast, whatever, I think there is an element of sacrifice that comes with that. And that's not to say you can't have a social life at all, but you should also understand there is an element of sacrifice that comes with being the very best at something.
Steven left me 30 seconds, so here we go. All right, I don't necessarily disagree with anything that they're saying. I will say that it is very fascinating to me, though, that Team Liquid, started last year, they were like, we're gonna have an office space, and then we're gonna have, like, everybody's gonna live on their own. And then what they ended up finding was that all the players just ended up deciding to all live together anyway, and so like the gaming house just came back together. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think certainly, I don't know if a 29-year-old woman should be forced to live with 4 other people or 5 other people.
I'm not forced. I chose this life.
She chose this life. That's true. But I do think that it'll evolve over time, and I think it's a case-by-case basis. But I don't know. I like doing house tours too. Those perform really well on site. So if we can keep those, that'd be good.
All right, everyone, we'll be hanging out, but thank you so much for coming, and we
you.
appreciate it.